and welcome to Morning Coffee with the Passionate Homeschooler. I'm Deanna, and today I want to talk to you about reading a little more actively than what we may do on a normal basis. Now, we have a student success course, and we talk about reading for learning versus reading for pleasure. And when you're reading nonfiction, you're usually setting out to learn something. And nonfiction, just like anything else that is written, has a particular goal in mind. Whoever's writing it down, whoever the author is, or the historian, or anybody who's writing, they're trying to write for a purpose. And as a reader, it's important for us to realize what that purpose is. We need to know who's the intended audience. Are they trying to make an argument? Are they trying to convince us of something? Are they just stating facts that they have found through primary sources or original sources, and they're letting us come to our own conclusion? And so when I was teaching college, these are things that I taught my students to do when they were looking at primary sources. And since my background is in history and anthropology, I'm going to use a couple of examples to show you how you can figure out what the purpose is, or the point of view, or if there's any bias, and what that might be. And so we're going to start with Herodotus. And he's a Greek historian. He's considered to be the father of history. And he wrote about the areas around Greece primarily, particularly Mesopotamia and in Egypt. And so when he was going around, he was asking the locals about their customs, and then he would document them. So in a section here about ancient Egypt, we can see that he is kind of putting in his own opinions. And this is something that we see quite a bit with ancient writers, because history wasn't the discipline like what we know it today, and it hadn't sort of evolved over time, where at one point there, at its height, it was all about objectivity and just trying to state the facts. But at this time period, in ancient Greece and Rome, and even in the early Middle Ages into the Renaissance, people that were writing history often put in their opinions. And so let me give you an example here with Herodotus. And he's writing about ancient Egypt. He says, "I now turn to their customs, the most sensible of which, in my opinion, is also practiced, I hear, by the Illyrian tribe. Once a year in every village, this is what they used to do." And so as you can see, when he's starting this section, he's already saying that this is a sensible custom. This is my opinion. And when we think of history today, we don't often think about historians, just coming out saying, well, this is my opinion. This is what they do, but this is what I think of it. Now, the Roman historian Tacitus did that as well. In his work, the Germania, he was documenting the Germanic tribes in the north from Rome. And he talks about their customs and whether they're good or bad. And so that was, again, very typical in the ancient world. So let's fast forward, and we're in the 21st century, 20th century, and we get books written by people like Jared Diamond, and he's a biologist, and he's written quite a bit of, a lot of popular books. Guns, Germs, and Steel is probably his most famous one. This is Collapse. And when you're reading contemporary history in particular, or really any nonfiction book that's been published in the last 50 or 60 years, it is imperative, and that is a strong word, but it is imperative that you read the preface or the introduction or that front material that my students would always skip over and say, oh, well, I don't have to read that part. I think that is some of the most important material in the entire book, because that is where you're going to learn the author's point of view. You're going to learn what their purpose is in writing this whole book, why they wrote it, the arguments they're trying to present, and what bias they have, if any. And so in Jared Diamond's Collapse, he also talks about some bias that he has and the purpose of writing. He says, I have belabored this necessity for both good individual studies and good comparisons because scholars practicing one approach too often belittle the contributions of the other approach. So he's doing a comparative analysis, and that's something that he's known for. And as a biologist, he studied birds and doing comparative analysis in biology and even in anthropology, looking at different cultures. That's how we really learn things, is by comparing things. And that goes back to Aristotle. And so that's the approach he's taking with this book. He also talks about, in this preface or in this beginning part, his point of view about, he argues that there are two sort of camps in the environmentalist movement. There are those that think that everything humans do, and I'm paraphrasing here, humans, and that the environment is changing and climate change and all that. And then there are those people that dispute that as being fact. And so he talks about having a background sort of on both sides, and so he can kind of see both pictures. But when you read this, you still understand what his purpose is in writing this book. Because when you sit down to write a book, and this one is quite long, it's over 500 pages, that's a commitment of life, right? And yeah, maybe you want to sell books and you want to do this, but it's because you want to get ideas out there. Books are full of ideas. And so knowing what the author is trying to do or what information they're presenting and why can really give you an active way of reading. And so you can assess and you can step back and maybe do a little bit of other research and formulate your own opinions. So you don't have to read everything and agree with it, right? So this is more of a critical way of reading instead of just kind of blindly accepting everything that you read. And I think in the modern world, as well as in the ancient world, we see examples where this is particularly critical. Now, this last example is from the history textbook that I used to use when I was teaching Western civilization in college. And again, history textbooks are these are secondary sources. And so when writing these books, the historian, and a lot of times it's a compilation, it's maybe a few or two historians working together, they have a particular purpose. They are trying to inform students about history, and they'll research primary sources, but sometimes they have a particular viewpoint that they're looking at history through. For instance, in a women's studies program, they may use books that look at how women were treated all across the spectrum, and they may pull in primary sources or what we call microhistories, which would be diaries or letters, things that women would have left behind. And so, or they could have a feminist particular viewpoint where they're looking at women as sort of being oppressed and things like that. And so when you're reading history books, or even your children are assigned these history books, it's really important to have a conversation with them and take their book and read the front material and find out what lens or what purpose or what point of view or what theoretical approach the author is using to write the book. Now, this particular book, this is by Clifford Bachman, and this is the one that I used. And he says this book adopts a thematic approach, but a theme seldom utilized by contemporary histories. While paying due attention to other aspects of Western development, it focuses on what might be called the history of values, that is, the assumptions that lie behind political and economic developments, behind intellectual and artistic ventures, and behind social trends and countertrends. And so that is his purpose. He's presenting history with those ideas in mind. Some books may present history with this sort of juxtaposition of oppressed and oppressor. And so everything in history has to fall in within these camps that are in this book. And so it's really important to be mindful of what the author is saying, what they're trying to get across, if they're trying to persuade. Now, my opinion in a history textbook is that it should be based really on what the history says and not trying to persuade or convince or make one very narrow argument. But there are history books that do that. So I hope this video has been helpful. I hope that the next time you pick up a work of nonfiction or even an ancient writing by Cicero or the historian Livy, that you kind of take a second and notice these little things that get slipped in there. And it's also in contemporary writings as well, possibly even more. So I'm off to go do some research on an article that I read the other day that I'm not sure that the author, normally they don't cite all of their sources, but I'm not really sure where the author drew their conclusions. So I'm going to go and try to find that. If you're enjoying our videos, please like them, share with your friends, subscribe. We have a lot of social media channels. We're on Instagram and Facebook. We have a podcast, so make sure you check us out. You can find us at pisonacademy.com/passionate homeschooler, and we'll see you next time.